There's nothing quite like the moment you realize the thing you love most has been suffering in silence. Henry Callahan knew that feeling all too well as he stood in his late brother's dusty barn, watching Buck, the old workhorse he'd raised, from a colt limping across the stall. At 70 years old, Henry had spent 45 years as a veterinarian, healing countless animals. But now, retired and back on the family farm, he discovered Buck's infected wound was worse than anyone knew. The horse had been neglected for months, maybe years. As Henry knelt down to examine the injury, he saw something in Buck's tired eyes that broke his heart. This wasn't just about saving a horse. Henry's own son wouldn't speak to him. The farm was falling apart, and he felt more lost than he had in decades. But what Henry found hidden beneath that wound would teach him that sometimes the deepest healing happens when you're trying to save someone else. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air carried the scent of autumn frost and forgotten promises as Henry Callahan pulled his weathered Ford pickup into the gravel driveway of what had once been the proudest farm in Millbrook County. 3 months had passed since Tom's funeral. 3 months since Henry had promised his sister-in-law Margaret that he'd come back and help sort things out. Now, standing before the sagging porch of the farmhouse where he'd grown up, Henry felt the weight of those broken promises settling on his shoulders like dust on an old book. His veterinary bag sat on the passenger seat, worn leather softened by decades of house calls and emergency visits. The brass nameplate still gleamed despite its age. Dr. Henry Callahan, DVM. 45 years of healing animals, of being the man people called when their beloved pets or livestock faced their darkest hours. He built a reputation that stretched across 3 counties, earned the respect of farmers and families alike. But here, on this plot of land where he'd learned to milk cows before he could properly tie his shoes, none of that seemed to matter. The farmhouse needed paint. The white clapboard siding had faded to a weathered gray, and several shutters hung at odd angles like broken wings. Tom had always been meticulous about maintenance, spending his weekends with paintbrush in hand or hammer swinging. Seeing the neglect now, Henry realized his brother must have been sick longer than anyone had let on. Margaret's car wasn't in the driveway. She'd mentioned something about grocery shopping in their brief phone conversation last week. Her voice careful and measured in that way people adopted when they'd grown tired of asking for help that never came. Henry had offered to come sooner. Of course, he'd offered many times over the past 5 years, ever since his wife Eleanor's death had left him rattling around the house like a marble in a coffee can. But there had always been something, a surgery that couldn't wait, a conference he'd committed to, a dozen excuses that seemed reasonable at the time. The barn dominated the landscape beyond the house, its red paint faded but structure still solid. Tom had always said the barn was the heart of any farm, and this one had been beating strong for over a century. Their grandfather had built it with his own hands, laying each board with the kind of care that came from knowing your great-grandchildren would someday play in the same hayloft where you'd carved your initials as a boy. Henry pulled his veterinary bag from the truck and walked toward the barn, his boots crunching on gravel mixed with fallen leaves. The massive sliding door stood, slightly ajar, just wide enough for a person to slip through sideways. The hinges protested with a long, mournful creak as he pulled the door open wider, flooding the interior with afternoon sunlight. The smell hit him first, not the sweet scent of fresh hay and well-maintained leather he remembered, but something stale and neglected. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light streaming through gaps in the siding, and cobwebs stretched between rafters like nature's own curtains. This wasn't the barn of his memory, where every tool had its place and every stall sparkled with fresh bedding. That's when he saw Buck. The Clydesdale stood in the far corner of his stall, head hanging low, favoring his left front leg in a way that made Henry's trained eye narrow with concern. Buck had been a colt when Henry left for veterinary school, all legs and ears and boundless energy. Tom had written letters about the young horse's progress, his potential for draft work, his gentle disposition despite his massive size. Over the years, Christmas cards had included photos of Buck pulling sleighs through snow-covered fields, standing proud at county fairs, working alongside Tom to bring in the harvest. Now Buck looked old. Not just mature, but genuinely aged, with gray around his muzzle and a weariness in his stance that spoke of hard years and little comfort. The magnificent animal who had once been the pride of Callahan Farm stood in a stall, thick with soiled bedding, his water bucket green with algae, his feed trough empty except for a scattering of moldy oats. "Hello, old friend," Henry said softly, approaching the stall with the measured movements that came naturally after decades of working with nervous animals. Buck raised his head slightly, brown eyes focusing on Henry with what seemed like recognition, or perhaps just hope that this human might be different from whoever had been neglecting him. Henry unlatched the stall door and stepped inside, running his hands along Buck's neck and shoulder, feeling for heat, swelling, or signs of pain. The horse stood patiently, occasionally turning his massive head to nuzzle Henry's shoulder. It was the left front leg, just as Henry had suspected. He knelt beside the horse, lifting the hoof with practiced ease, and immediately saw the problem. The wound was worse than he'd initially thought. What had probably started as a simple puncture from a nail or piece of wire had become infected, the tissue around it angry and swollen. Pus seeped from the injury, and the smell of infection was unmistakable. In his years of practice, Henry had seen wounds like this progress to the point where the only humane option was euthanasia. Buck wasn't there yet, but he wasn't far from it either. "How long has this been going on?" Henry murmured, more to himself than to the horse. Buck couldn't tell him about the weeks or months of pain, about standing in his own waste because movement hurt too much, about the gradual deterioration that happened when no one was paying attention to the details that mattered. Henry opened his veterinary bag, its contents as familiar as his own reflection. Syringes, medications, bandages, surgical instruments, the tools of his trade, organized with the precision that had served him well through thousands of cases. He'd brought antibiotics, anti-inflammatory drugs, everything he might need for basic treatment. But looking at Buck's condition now, he realized this wouldn't be basic at all. The infection had spread beyond the original wound site. The leg was hot to the touch, swollen from the knee down, and Buck's reluctance to bear weight suggested the pain was significant. This would require intensive treatment, daily care, and the kind of attention that Henry wasn't sure he could provide. Alone, as he cleaned the wound with antiseptic solution, Henry's mind drifted to his son David, 38 years old now, a successful veterinarian in his own right, practicing small animal medicine in Portland. They spoke perhaps 4 times a year, stilted conversations about weather and work that carefully avoided any mention of the growing distance between them. David had his own practice, his own life, his own family that Henry barely knew. The last time Henry had seen his grandson was at Eleanor's funeral, 2 years ago. 8-year-old. Michael had stood between his parents like a small soldier, dressed in a suit that made him look impossibly grown-up. He'd hugged his grandfather with the automatic politeness children displayed at funerals, but there had been no real connection, no shared memories to bridge the years of absence. Henry had tried to call David the week before, thinking his son might want to know about Buck's condition. The conversation had lasted less than 5 minutes. David had been busy, had patients to see, had made it clear that the family farm and its problems weren't his responsibility. He'd inherited his mother's practical nature and his father's stubborn streak, but none of Henry's sentimental attachment to the place where 3 generations of Callahans had built their lives. Buck shifted his weight, bringing Henry's attention back to the present. The horse was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes, patient despite his pain, trusting in a way that made Henry's chest tight with emotion. Animals didn't hold grudges the way people did. They didn't carry resentment, like a stone in their pocket, pulling it out to examine whenever they felt particularly sorry for themselves. "We're going to get you better," Henry promised, his voice rough with conviction he wasn't entirely sure he felt. "Whatever it takes, we're going to fix this." The barn door creaked, and footsteps approached a dusty floor. Henry looked up to see Margaret silhouetted in the doorway, her gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her face lined with the kind of worry that came from carrying burdens alone for too long. "I saw your truck in the driveway," she said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd grown tired of disappointment, finally decided to come check on things. Margaret had aged since Eleanor's funeral. She'd been Tom's wife for 34 years, his partner in every sense of the word, and his death had left her adrift in ways that showed in the slope of her shoulders and the careful way she held herself, as if sudden movements might cause something else important to break. "I'm sorry," Henry said, straightening up from beside Buck. "I should have come sooner." Margaret stepped into the barn, her gaze taking in Buck's condition with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades caring for animals. Her face tightened, with anger and grief in equal measure. "He's been like this for months," she said. "Ever since Tom got too sick to come out here regularly. I did what I could, but I don't know anything about treating injuries like that. I kept thinking you'd come, or David would come, or someone would care enough to help." The accusation hung in the air between them, justified and painful. Henry had been so focused on winding down his practice, on dealing with his own grief and loneliness, that he'd let the responsibilities of family slide away like water through his fingers. "I'm here now," Henry said. "I'm going to take care of Buck, and I'm going to help with whatever else needs doing." Margaret studied his face for a long moment, searching for something: sincerity, commitment, or perhaps just the brother-in-law she remembered from better times. "Tom always said you had good hands," she said finally. "Said you could heal anything if you put your mind to it." Henry looked down at his hands, still steady despite his 70 years, still capable of the delicate work that had defined his career. He'd healed thousands of animals, had developed a reputation for taking on cases that other veterinarians considered hopeless, but he'd never figured out how to heal the wounds that mattered most: the distance between himself and his son, the regrets that accumulated like interest on an unpaid debt, the knowledge that he'd spent so much time saving others that he'd neglected to save himself. "I don't know about anything," Henry said, running his hand along Buck's neck, "but I know about this, and I know it's not too late." That evening, Henry sat at the farmhouse kitchen table with his cell phone in his hands, David's number highlighted on the screen. Margaret bustled around the kitchen, preparing dinner with the efficient movements of someone who'd been cooking for farm hands and family for decades. The smell of pot roast filled the air, rich and comforting, but Henry's stomach was tight with apprehension. "Just call him," Margaret said, without looking up from the carrots she was chopping. "He's your son. He's made it pretty clear he doesn't want to hear from me unless someone's dying," Henry replied, thumb hovering over the call button. "Well, Buck might be dying if you don't get some help with that infection." Henry pressed the button before he could talk himself out of it. The phone rang 4 times before David's voice answered, professional and slightly impatient. "Dr. Callahan's office. This is David." "It's your father." "It's your father." A pause that stretched too long, filled with the weight of 2 years of stilted conversations and missed opportunities. "Dad, what's wrong? Is Margaret okay?" Even in his hurry to establish that this wasn't a social call, David's first concern was for Margaret rather than his father. The observation stung, but Henry pushed past it. "Margaret's fine. It's Buck, Tom's horse. He's got a bad infection in his front leg, and I could use another set of hands." Another pause. Henry could hear the sounds of a busy veterinary clinic. In the background, dogs barking, phones ringing, the controlled chaos of a practice in full swing. Can't you handle it yourself? You've been doing this longer than I've been alive. I can handle the medical side, Henry said, choosing his words carefully. But it's going to require intensive care, round-the-clock monitoring for the first few days. I thought maybe you could... I can't just drop everything and drive 4 hours to help with a horse. Dad, I have responsibilities here, patients depending on me. The words hit Henry like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were exactly what Henry himself might have said 30 years ago. How many times had he told Eleanor he couldn't come home for dinner because someone's dog needed surgery? How many school plays and baseball games had he missed because a farmer's prize bull was having breathing problems? I understand, Henry said quietly. I just thought I'd ask. Look, if it's really that serious, maybe you should call someone. Local Dr. Peterson in town, or Peterson retired last year. Then someone else. There has to be another veterinarian within driving distance. Henry closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of his son's impatience. In the background, he could hear a woman's voice calling David's name, probably his wife Sarah, needing him for something related to their children or their household. David had built the kind of life Henry had always been too busy to maintain stable. Present, involved. You're right, Henry said. I'll figure something out. Dad, I didn't mean... David started, but Henry had already ended the call. Margaret set a plate of pot roast in front of him, her movements gentle despite the tension in the room. That went well, she said, settling into the chair across from him. About as well as I expected. That evening, Henry sat at the farmhouse kitchen table with his cell phone in his hands, David's number highlighted on the screen. Margaret bustled around the kitchen, preparing dinner with the efficient movements of someone who'd been cooking for farm hands and family for decades. The smell of pot roast filled the air, rich and comforting, but Henry's stomach was tight with apprehension. Just call him, Margaret said, without looking up from the carrots she was chopping. He's your son. He's made it pretty clear he doesn't want to hear from me unless someone's dying, Henry replied, thumb hovering over the call button. Well, Buck might be dying if you don't get some help with that infection. Henry pressed the button before. He could talk himself out of it. The phone rang 4 times before David's voice answered, professional and slightly impatient. Dr. Callahan's office. This is David. It's your father. A pause that stretched too long, filled with the weight of 2 years of stilted conversations and missed opportunities. Dad, what's wrong? Is Margaret okay? Even in his hurry to establish that this wasn't a social call, David's first concern was for Margaret rather than his father. The observation stung, but Henry pushed past it. Margaret's fine. It's Buck, Tom's horse. He's got a bad infection in his front leg, and I could use another set of hands. Another pause. Henry could hear the sounds of a busy veterinary clinic. In the background, dogs barking, phones ringing, the controlled chaos of a practice in full swing. Can't you handle it yourself? You've been doing this longer than I've been alive. I can handle the medical side, Henry said, choosing his words carefully. But it's going to require intensive care, round-the-clock monitoring for the first few days. I thought maybe you could... I can't just drop everything and drive 4 hours to help with a horse. Dad, I have responsibilities here. Patients depending on me. The words hit Henry like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were exactly what Henry himself might have said 30 years ago. How many times had he told Eleanor he couldn't come home for dinner because someone's dog needed surgery? How many school plays and baseball games had he missed because a farmer's prize bull was having breathing problems? I understand, Henry said quietly. I just thought I'd ask. Look, if it's really that serious, maybe you should call someone. Local, Dr. Peterson in town, or Peterson retired last year. Then someone else. There has to be another veterinarian within driving distance. Henry closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of his son's impatience. In the background, he could hear a woman's voice calling David's name, probably his wife Sarah, needing him for something related to their children or their household. David had built the kind of life Henry had always been too busy to maintain stable. Present, involved. "You're right," Henry said. "I'll figure something out." "Dad, I didn't mean," David started. But Henry had already ended the call. Margaret set a plate of pot roast in front of him, her movements gentle despite the tension in the room. "That went well," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "About as well as I expected." The next morning arrived gray and cold, with frost painting the windows of the farmhouse kitchen in delicate patterns that reminded Henry of his mother's lace curtains. He'd been awake since 4:30, his internal clock still set to the rhythm of emergency calls and early surgeries that had defined 4 decades of veterinary practice. Coffee steamed in his mug as he sat at the table, staring at his phone and replaying the previous night's conversation with David. His son had listened to the confession about Sunshine's death in complete silence, the kind of silence that could mean shock, anger, or simply the careful consideration that David brought to most serious matters. When Henry finished talking, David had asked only one question: "Does this change anything about Buck's treatment?" When Henry said no, David had simply said, "I'll think about what you've told me," and hung up. Now, 12 hours later, Henry wasn't sure if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life or taken the first step toward something that might eventually resemble forgiveness. Buck was worse this morning. The infection had spread visibly overnight, the swelling extending further up his leg. His temperature elevated enough that Henry could feel the heat radiating from his body even before he touched him. The old horse stood with his head hanging low, barely acknowledging Henry's presence as he entered the stall. "I know, old friend," Henry murmured, running his hands along Buck's neck and feeling the tension in the massive muscles. "I know it hurts." Henry had brought his full medical kit from the truck, along with supplies he'd picked up from the farm store in town yesterday evening. The proprietor, Jake Morrison, had raised his eyebrows at the quantity of antibiotics and wound care materials Henry requested, but had filled the order without question. Jake had known Henry since childhood, had watched him grow from the boy who helped his father shoe horses to the respected veterinarian who delivered half the calves in the county. "Heard you were back in town," Jake had said as he loaded supplies into Henry's truck. "Margaret's been carrying a heavy load since Tom passed. Good of you to help out." Henry had nodded, accepting the gentle rebuke for what it was. In a community like Millbrook, people noticed when family obligations went unmet, when promises were made and quietly forgotten. Margaret had been too proud to ask for help directly, but the whole town knew she was struggling to maintain the farm alone. Now, Henry knelt beside Buck's injured leg, cleaning the wound with gentle efficiency, while the horse stood patiently despite obvious pain. The infection was aggressive, the kind that could easily turn septic if not treated aggressively and immediately. Henry administered antibiotics, anti-inflammatory medication, and a mild sedative to help Buck rest more comfortably. Working with his hands again, focusing completely on the medical challenge in front of him, Henry felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose. Retirement had left him adrift in ways he hadn't anticipated. Without the constant demands of practice, without animals depending on his expertise, he'd felt increasingly irrelevant, like a book that had been read and shelved indefinitely. But here, in this dusty barn, with Buck depending on his skill and experience, Henry remembered why he'd chosen this profession in the first place. It wasn't just about the medicine, though he'd always found satisfaction in diagnosis and treatment. It was about the bond between humans and animals, the trust that allowed a 1,000-pound horse to stand quietly while a human invaded his space with needles and instruments. The halter hanging on the wall caught Henry's attention as he worked. It was small, clearly meant for a pony rather than a draft horse, and worn smooth by years of use. He recognized it immediately, David's first training halter, the one he'd used when learning to lead and groom his childhood pony. Patches. David had been 7 when Henry bought Patches, a gentle Shetland with more patience than sense and a talent for getting into mischief. Henry could still picture his son leading the pony around the barnyard, his small hands confident on the lead rope, his face serious with concentration as he practiced the knots and techniques Henry had taught him. Those had been good years, before Sunshine's death had poisoned everything with guilt and distance. David had been eager to learn, quick to absorb the lessons Henry shared about animal behavior and care. He'd shown real aptitude for the work, an intuitive understanding of how to approach nervous animals and read their body language. Henry wondered if David still remembered those early lessons, if somewhere beneath the professional competence and adult responsibilities, the boy who'd loved animals with pure, uncomplicated joy still existed. His phone buzzed with a text message. Henry fumbled for it, with hands still damp from cleaning Buck's wound, expecting to see Margaret's name on the screen. Instead, he found a message from David. "How is he this morning?" Henry stared at the words for a moment, then typed back, "Worse. Infection spreading. Started aggressive antibiotic treatment." The response came quickly. "Good. Text me updates every few hours. I want to track his progress." It wasn't much, but it was more communication than Henry had received from his son in months. He saved David's number to his favorites list and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Margaret appeared in the barn doorway, carrying a thermos of coffee and what looked like breakfast wrapped in a dish towel. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, settling herself on a hay bale near Buck's stall. "And I figured Buck could use some company while he heals." Henry accepted the coffee gratefully, warming his hands around the thermos cup. Margaret had included biscuits with honey, the kind Tom had always claimed were better than anything served in fancy restaurants. "David texted," Henry said between bites. "Wants updates on Buck's condition." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's something." "I suppose. It's more than I expected after last night." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching Buck doze fitfully in his stall. The horse's breathing was labored, and he occasionally shifted his weight with obvious discomfort. But he seemed calmer than he had the day before. "You?" "No," Margaret said eventually. "Tom always regretted the advice he gave you about keeping that secret." Henry looked at her sharply. "He never said anything to me about regretting it." Tom wasn't the kind of man to second-guess himself out loud, but especially in his last few months, when he was thinking a lot about legacy and what we leave behind, he wondered if he'd been wrong. Margaret smoothed her hands over her jeans, a nervous gesture Henry remembered from family gatherings decades ago. He said the truth has a way of coming out eventually, and when it does, the lying always makes it worse. Why didn't he tell me that? Because by then, so much time had passed that telling the truth seemed cruel to everyone involved. David had built his career partly on the foundation of that lie, and you built your guilt around protecting it. Margaret met his eyes. Tom said it was like a broken bone that healed wrong. Sometimes you have to break it again to fix it properly. Henry considered this, thinking about the careful distance David maintained, the polite but impersonal phone. Talls, the grandchildren he barely knew. Perhaps the healing had indeed gone wrong, creating a functional but fundamentally flawed relationship that served no one well. Buck stirred in his stall, lifting his massive head to look at Henry with those intelligent brown eyes. There was still pain there, but also something that might have been hope, the kind of trust that animals placed in humans when they believed healing was possible. Henry's phone buzzed again. Another message from David. "Let me know if you need me to consult on treatment options." This time, Henry smiled as he typed his response. "I will. Thank you." 3 days after beginning Buck's treatment, Margaret knocked on the farmhouse guest room door at 6:30 in the evening, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone extending an invitation they weren't entirely sure would be accepted. "I'm making dinner for 2 tonight," she called through the door. "Figured it might be nice to eat at the table instead of standing over the kitchen sink." Henry had been sprawling across the narrow bed, reading veterinary journals on his tablet and checking his watch every 20 minutes to time Buck's next dose of medication. The guest room hadn't changed much since his last visit 5 years ago, the same quilt his mother had sewn during the long winter of 1963, the same photographs of family reunions and county fair ribbons, the same view of the barn where he'd been spending most of his waking hours. "I'll be down in a few minutes," he replied, grateful for the invitation, despite the awkwardness that had settled between them like dust on furniture. Margaret had been unfailingly polite since his arrival, but there was a careful distance in her manner that spoke to years of disappointment and broken promises. When Henry entered the kitchen, he found the table set with the good china, the wedding pattern Margaret and Tom had received as newlyweds, saved for special occasions and holiday meals. Candles flickered in the center of the table, and the smell of roast chicken filled the air with warmth and comfort. "This is lovely," Henry said, settling into the chair that had been Tom's for 34 years of marriage. "You didn't need to go to all this trouble." "Wasn't any trouble," Margaret replied, though Henry noticed she'd changed from her work clothes into a blue dress he remembered from Eleanor's funeral. "Besides, I was tired of eating alone." The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable, in a way that made Henry realize how isolated Margaret had become since Tom's death. The farm had always been a social place, with neighbors stopping by for coffee and advice, hired hands gathering around the kitchen table for lunch, grandchildren racing through the house during summer visits. Now it was just Margaret, maintaining routines that had once accommodated a household full of life and laughter. They ate quietly at first, making small talk about Buck's improving condition and the weather forecast for the coming week. But as the meal progressed and the wine Margaret had opened began to soften the edges of their conversation, the topics grew more personal. "David called me this afternoon," Margaret said, refilling their glasses with the careful precision of someone who rarely drank alone. Henry looked up sharply. "He did? Wanted to know how you were doing, whether you seemed stable." The word hit Henry like a slap. "Stable?" Margaret's cheeks colored slightly. "I think he's worried about you, Henry. The retirement, Eleanor's death. Now this business with confessing about Sunshine after all these years." She met his eyes across the table. "He thinks you might be having some kind of breakdown." Henry set down his fork, appetite suddenly gone. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you seemed like the same Henry I've always known, just older and sadder, and maybe a little more honest than you used to be." Margaret reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. "I also told him that honesty isn't the same thing as instability." They finished dinner while Margaret shared stories Henry had never heard about. Tom's struggles with depression after their miscarriage in 1987, about the financial crisis that had nearly cost them the farm in the early 90s, about the quiet ways Tom had worried about his brother's increasing isolation after Eleanor's death. "He used to say you were carrying too much guilt for one person," Margaret said as they cleared the dishes together. "Not just about David, but about choosing your career over family time, about all the moments you missed while you were saving other people's animals." Henry dried a plate with unnecessary attention to detail, processing this insight into his brother's thoughts. Tom had never been one for deep emotional conversations, preferring to show affection through actions rather than words. Learning that he'd been worried about Henry's emotional state came as both a comfort and a rebuke. "I never knew he felt that way. Tom respected what you'd built with your practice. He was proud of your reputation, proud that people trusted you with their most precious animals." Margaret rinsed the last glass and handed it to Henry to dry. But he also thought you'd forgotten how to let people take care of you. After dinner, they sat in the living room with coffee and the recipe box Margaret had inherited from Tom's mother. The wooden box was worn smooth by decades of handling, its brass hinges gleaming despite their age. Inside, handwritten cards chronicled 3 generations of family meals, Christmas cookies and Easter hams, birthday cakes and comfort foods for times of illness or grief. "Your mother's apple pie recipe is in here," Margaret said, pulling out a card written in Eleanor's careful script. "She gave it to me when Tom and I got engaged, said it was the only way to guarantee a happy marriage." Henry smiled at the memory of his mother's legendary apple pies, the way she'd roll out pastry with patient precision while lecturing him and Tom about the importance of doing things properly the first time. Eleanor had never quite mastered the recipe, despite years of trying, but Henry had never had the heart to tell her that her attempts, while delicious, never quite matched his mother's standard. "Eleanor tried to make that pie for David's birthday every year," Henry said. "She'd get so frustrated when the crust didn't turn out right. She was a good mother," Margaret said quietly. David was lucky to have her. The implication was clear, and Henry felt it settle in his chest like a weight. Eleanor had been the parent who attended school plays and baseball games, who helped with homework and listened to childhood worries. Henry had been the one who provided financial security and professional prestige, but who had missed the daily moments that actually mattered to a growing child. "I keep thinking about Buck," Henry said eventually, "about how that infection festered because no one was paying attention to the details that mattered." Margaret closed the recipe box and looked at him with the direct gaze that had made her such an effective farm wife. "People aren't horses, Henry, but they do need tending, and they do need someone to notice when they're hurting." Late that night, Henry sat in the barn with Buck, changing bandages and administering medication by the light of a single bulb hanging from the rafters. The horse was improving. The swelling had decreased noticeably, and he was bearing more weight on the injured leg. But recovery would be slow, requiring weeks of careful attention and gradual rehabilitation. As Henry worked, his phone buzzed with another text from David. "How's the patient tonight?" Henry typed back, "Better. Swelling down, more alert. Still a long way to go. Good. You're doing the right thing." Henry stared at the message for a long moment, wondering if David was talking about Buck's treatment or something larger. Either way, it was the first time in years that his son had expressed approval of anything Henry had done. "Thank you," Henry typed back. "That means more than you know." A week into Buck's treatment, Henry discovered Tom's workshop tucked behind the main barn, its existence revealed only when he went searching for better lighting equipment to help with the horses' evening care. The wooden building was smaller than he remembered from childhood visits, its weathered siding the same gray as the farmhouse, but the heavy padlock on the door suggested it contained something worth protecting. Margaret found the key in Tom's desk drawer, her hands trembling slightly as she worked the old lock. "He spent hours out here," she said, "especially after he retired from the heavy farm work. Said it gave him peace." The door swung open to reveal a workshop that spoke of careful craftsmanship and patient attention to detail. Hand tools hung from pegboard walls in precise arrangements, their handles polished smooth by decades of use. A workbench dominated the center of the space, its surface scarred but clean, marked by the ghosts of countless projects. Wood shavings carpeted the floor, filling the air with the scent of cedar and pine. But it was the unfinished projects that caught Henry's attention. A rocking chair missing its final coat of stain, a jewelry box with delicate hinges waiting to be installed, a child's wooden horse carved with loving detail but never painted. Each piece represented time Tom had run out of, plans interrupted by illness and death. "He was making the horse for Michael," Margaret said, noticing Henry's focus on the carved toy. "David's boy." Tom was so excited when he heard about becoming a great uncle, even though he'd never actually met the child. The observation stung more than Henry cared to admit. His grandson was 10 years old now, and Tom had died without ever holding him, playing with him, sharing the kind of memories that connected generations. Another relationship Henry had failed to nurture. Another bridge he'd allowed to burn through neglect and misplaced priorities. Henry ran his fingers along the wooden horse's mane, feeling the careful detail Tom had carved into each strand. His brother had possessed the kind of patience Henry had never managed to develop, the ability to work slowly toward a distant goal, to find satisfaction in the process rather than rushing toward completion. "I could finish it," Henry said. "The horse, if you think David would want Michael to have it." Margaret smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Henry had seen from her since his arrival. "I think Tom would like that very much." Over the following days, Henry established a routine that felt more natural than anything he'd experienced since retirement. Mornings began with Buck's care cleaning wounds, administering medications, assessing progress with the methodical attention that had made him a respected veterinarian. The horse was responding well to treatment, bearing more weight each day, his eyes brighter and more alert. But afternoons belonged to the workshop, where Henry found himself drawn to the familiar rhythm of working with his hands. Tom's tools felt comfortable in his grip, their weight and balance designed for efficiency and precision. Henry had forgotten the satisfaction of creating something tangible, of seeing progress measured in smooth wood and tight joints rather than healing tissue and laboratory results. The work was therapeutic in ways he hadn't anticipated. Sanding the wooden horse's surface required the same steady concentration he'd once brought to delicate surgeries, the same attention to detail that had served him well in diagnosis and treatment. But unlike veterinary medicine, woodworking allowed for correction and improvement, for sanding away mistakes and starting fresh. On Thursday afternoon, David's car pulled into the farmyard while Henry was in the workshop, applying a careful coat of primer to the wooden horse. The sound of car doors slamming and unfamiliar voices carried through the workshop's single window, followed by Margaret's delighted greeting. Henry set down his brush and stepped outside to find his son standing beside a silver sedan, looking around the farmyard with the careful attention of someone cataloging changes and deterioration. David had inherited Eleanor's height and careful posture, but his face carried the weathered look of someone who spent long hours under fluorescent lights, solving other people's problems. Beside him stood a woman Henry recognized from Christmas cards as Sarah, David's wife, and a boy who had to be Michael taller than Henry had expected, with David's serious expression and Eleanor's auburn hair. "Dad," David said, his voice carefully neutral. "We were driving through on our way to Sarah's mother's house. Thought we'd stop and check on Buck." It was a reasonable explanation, though. Henry suspected Portland to Central Oregon didn't require a detour through Millbrook County. More likely, David had been worried enough about his father's mental state to make the trip specifically to assess the situation. "He's doing much better," Henry said, wiping wood stain from his hands with a rag. "Would you like to see him?" They walked to the barn as a group, Michael staying close to his parents in the way of children encountering unfamiliar territory. Buck stood in his stall with his head high, alert and interested in the visitors. The improvement from a week ago was dramatic. The swelling had reduced significantly, and the horse was bearing normal weight on his injured leg. David entered the stall with practiced ease, running his hands along Buck's neck and examining the healing wound with professional thoroughness. His movements were confident and gentle, revealing the skill that had made him successful in his own practice. "You've done excellent work," David said, genuine surprise coloring his voice. "I wasn't sure, given his age and the extent of the infection." "He's a tough old horse," Henry replied. "Sometimes experience counts for more than youth." They stood together in the stall, 3 generations of veterinarians united by their shared understanding of animal medicine, their common language of diagnosis and treatment. Michael pressed his face against the stall door, watching Buck with the kind of fascination children displayed when encountering something both enormous and gentle. "Can I pet him?" Michael asked. Henry looked to David, who nodded permission. Together, grandfather and grandson approached the big horse, Henry guiding Michael's small hand to Buck's velvet nose. "He's so soft," Michael whispered, wonder filling his voice. "Horses are like that," Henry said, remembering David at the same age, the same expression of delight when encountering farm animals for the first time. "They look powerful and scary, but they're gentle if you treat them with respect." Sarah documented the moment with her phone, capturing Michael's first real interaction with his grandfather. Henry found himself grateful for her instinct to preserve the memory, even as he wondered if it would be filed away with other family photos that rarely saw the light of day. Later, as they prepared to leave, David lingered by his car while Sarah settled Michael into his car seat. "The workshop looks good," David said. "I saw you through the window when we drove up. Tom left some unfinished projects. Seemed wrong to let them sit there incomplete." David nodded, understanding the impulse, even if he couldn't quite approve of it. "Dad, about what you told me on the phone about sunshine." Henry felt his chest tighten with anxiety. "What about it?" "I need time to process it. It changes things, but I'm not sure how yet." David met his father's eyes directly. "But I want you to know that Buck looks better than I expected. Whatever else happened in the past, you still know how to heal." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. Henry watched his son's car disappear down the gravel road, carrying his family back to their organized life in Portland, and found himself thinking about the wooden horse waiting in Tom's workshop. Perhaps healing, like woodworking, was a process that required patience, careful attention, and the willingness to sand away old mistakes before applying a new finish. The photo album surfaced on a Tuesday morning when Henry was searching the farmhouse attic for extension cords to improve the lighting in Tom's workshop. Margaret had mentioned the electrical supplies might be stored among the boxes of Christmas decorations and seasonal clothing, but Henry found himself distracted by the accumulated memories of 3 generations scattered across the dusty floor. The album lay beneath a stack of Tom's high school yearbooks, its leather cover cracked with age but still intact. Henry recognized it immediately. The same album his mother had carefully maintained, documenting family milestones with the methodical attention she'd brought to all her domestic responsibilities. Each photograph was held in place with corner tabs, accompanied by her neat handwriting identifying dates, occasions, and the names of people who might otherwise be forgotten by time. Henry settled cross-legged on the attic floor, the album heavy in his lap, and turned to the first page. There he was at age 5, gap-toothed and grinning beside a newborn calf, his small hands surprisingly gentle on the animal's neck. Tom stood beside him, protective and proud, only 3 years older, but already assuming the role of responsible big brother that would define their relationship for decades. The early pages chronicled a childhood Henry had largely forgotten summer. Afternoons spent fishing in the creek that bordered the farm. Winter evenings when the family gathered around the radio to listen to programs that held their attention before television changed everything. His mother had captured moments of ordinary joy. Birthday parties in the farmhouse kitchen. Christmas mornings with presents spread beneath a tree cut from their own land. Easter egg hunts that ranged across acres of pasture and woodland. But it was the later pages that drew Henry's attention. The photographs from David's childhood that his mother had continued to collect, despite Henry's increasing absence from family gatherings. There was David at 2, tottering across the farmyard with his arms outstretched for balance. David at 5, helping Tom feed chickens with the serious concentration of a child given important responsibility. David at 8, leading Patches, the pony around the corral while Henry watched from the fence, his veterinary bag visible in the background, probably between farm calls, stealing a few minutes with his family before rushing off to the next emergency. One photograph stopped Henry. Cold. David at 12, the summer before Sunshine's death, sitting bareback on the little mare with confidence and joy radiating from every line of his body. The horse's ears were pricked forward, alert and happy, her coat gleaming in the afternoon. Son. David's smile was pure delight, the expression of a boy who believed his father could fix anything, heal anyone, make the world right through skill and determination. Henry stared at the image for a long time, remembering that version of his son, eager, trusting, full of admiration for the father who seemed to possess magical abilities. David had wanted to be just like Henry in those days, had practiced bandaging techniques on stuffed animals, had memorized the names of medications and their uses, had dreamed of the day when he'd be old enough to help with real cases. The transformation had been gradual but devastating. After Sunshine's death, David's enthusiasm had curdled into something more desperate, a need to understand what had gone wrong rather than simple joy in learning. His questions had become more pointed, his observations more critical. By high school, he'd been watching Henry with the analytical eye of someone studying a problem rather than the admiring gaze of a son who wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. Found you. Margaret's voice came from behind him, followed by the careful sounds of someone navigating the narrow attic stairs. I wondered where you disappeared to. Henry looked up to find her emerging through the access hole, dust motes dancing in the light that followed her. She took in the scene Henry surrounded by scattered photographs. The album opened to David's childhood and settled beside him with a soft sigh. I haven't looked at those pictures in years, she said, leaning over to examine the photograph of David and Sunshine. Tom always said that was his favorite picture of David. Captured him right before everything got complicated. I was a terrible father, Henry said quietly, not looking up from the album. Look at all these family moments I missed. Margaret reached over and turned the page, revealing more photographs from family gatherings and farm celebrations. In most of them, Henry was absent or clearly distracted, his attention somewhere else, even when his body was present. You were a complicated father, Margaret corrected. There's a difference. She pointed to a photograph of David's 10th birthday party, where Henry sat at the edge of the group, still wearing his work clothes, obviously having arrived late from a veterinary call. But his attention was completely focused on David, who was showing off a new fishing rod with excitement. You weren't around as much as you should have been, Margaret continued. But when you were present, you were really present. David knew. You loved him, even if he didn't understand why your work always seemed to come first. Henry turned more pages, finding evidence of what Margaret described. Christmas mornings, where he clearly made an effort to stay home. Family vacations, where his veterinary bag was nowhere to be seen. Quiet moments captured when he thought no one was watching, teaching David to tie fishing knots, helping him with homework, reading bedtime stories with the same careful attention he brought to medical procedures. Eleanor used to say you had two settings, Margaret said. Completely absorbed in work or completely devoted to family. The problem was that work absorbed you about 80% of the time. And now David's making the same mistakes I did. Henry observed, thinking about his son's busy practice, his reluctance to take time away from his patients, even for family emergencies. Maybe he learned from watching you what happens when work becomes everything. Margaret closed the album gently. Either way, it's not too late to show him there's another way. They climbed down from the attic together, Henry carrying the album and a box of extension cords Margaret had located while he'd been lost in memories. In the kitchen, she made coffee while Henry continued flipping through photographs, paying attention now to details he'd missed during his first examination. There were pictures of Tom and Margaret's wedding, where Henry served as best man despite being in the middle of veterinary school. Images from Eleanor's funeral, where David stood close to his father, supporting rather than being supported. Recent photographs from farm gatherings where Henry was notably absent. His empty chair at family dinners, a silent testimony to relationships he'd allowed to drift. But there were also pictures that told a different story, moments of connection. Evidence of love that had survived despite distance and disappointment. David and Eleanor visiting Henry's clinic, where David wore a white coat that was too big for him and pretended to examine a patient cat. Henry teaching Michael to fish during one of their rare visits, both of them concentrating intensely on the proper technique for casting a line. "You know what I think," Margaret said, setting a coffee cup beside Henry's elbow. "I think you spent so many years focusing on what you did wrong that you forgot about what you did right." Henry looked at a photograph of himself with David, both of them covered in mud after helping deliver a difficult calf, both grinning with the satisfaction of shared accomplishment. "Maybe it's time to remember," he said. That afternoon, Henry returned to Tom's workshop with renewed purpose. The wooden horse was nearly complete, needing only final sanding and a protective coat of clear varnish. But as he worked, Henry found himself thinking about other projects he might undertake, not just finishing Tom's incomplete work, but creating something entirely new. By evening, he'd sketched plans for a child-sized workbench, complete with tool storage and a vise sized for small hands. If Michael was anything like his father and grandfather, he'd want to build things to create and repair and improve the world around him. Henry might not be able to give his grandson the years of daily presence he'd failed to provide David, but he could offer him tools and the knowledge of how to use them. It was a start. Perhaps not enough to repair all the damage from years of absence and misplaced priorities, but enough to begin building something new. The medical records surfaced 3 weeks into Henry's stay, hidden beneath a stack of farm insurance documents in Tom's desk drawer, like secrets waiting to ambush the unwary. Margaret had asked Henry to help organize Tom's paperwork for the accountant, a task that seemed straightforward until he discovered the manila folder marked veterinary files in his brother's careful handwriting. Henry's hands trembled as he opened the folder, not because he suspected what lay inside, but because seeing his own professional letterhead in Tom's desk felt like encountering a ghost. The first few documents were routine vaccination records for farm animals, health certificates for cattle sales, the ordinary paperwork that connected Henry's practice to the family farm. But beneath those familiar forms lay something that made Henry's breath catch in his throat. A complete set of medical records for a horse named Sunshine, dated 26 years ago, documenting every detail of her final night. The records were in Henry's own handwriting, his younger self's careful notes describing symptoms, treatment decisions, and medication dosages with the precision that had made him a respected veterinarian. Henry stared at the dosage calculations, his eyes tracing numbers he'd written in exhaustion and darkness all those years ago. The mistake was there in black ink, undeniable and devastating, a decimal point in the wrong position, transforming a therapeutic dose of pain medication into a lethal overdose. Below his original notes, Tom had added calculations in red ink, working backward from the fatal dose to understand exactly what had gone wrong. But it was the letter clipped to the back of the file that destroyed Henry completely. Written in Tom's hand on farm letterhead, it was addressed to the State Veterinary Board. To whom it may concern, I am writing to report a serious medication error that occurred during the treatment of my nephew's horse on the night of October 15th. Dr. Henry Callahan, in a state of severe fatigue after working continuously for over 30 hours, miscalculated the dosage of butorphanol, resulting in the death of the animal. While I understand this error represents a serious breach of professional standards, I believe the circumstances, Dr. Callahan's exhaustion, and the emergency nature of the situation warrant consideration. I am requesting that this matter be handled with discretion, as the error was clearly unintentional, and Dr. Callahan has an otherwise exemplary record of professional conduct. The letter was dated 3 days after Sunshine's death, but it was unsigned. A yellow sticky note attached. To the corner bore Tom's handwriting, "Never sent." Henry's career would be over. David would be destroyed. Some secrets are too big for the truth. Henry sank into Tom's desk chair, the weight of this discovery settling over him like a physical blow. For 26 years, he'd carried the guilt of his mistake, but he'd never known that Tom had been prepared to report him to the state board. His brother had possessed complete documentation of Henry's professional failure, had drafted a formal complaint that would have ended his veterinary career, and had chosen instead to protect him. The protection had come at a cost that Henry was only now beginning to understand. Tom had carried the burden of this secret for decades, had watched his brother's relationship with David deteriorate while knowing the truth that might have provided context, if not forgiveness. He'd seen Henry retreat into work and guilt, had watched the family fracture along lines that might have been healed with honesty, and had said nothing. Margaret's footsteps on the stairs announced her approach, but Henry couldn't move to hide the documents. She found him sitting motionless at the desk, the medical records spread before him like evidence at a trial. "Oh, Henry," Margaret said, her voice heavy with recognition and sympathy. "You found them? You knew?" Margaret settled into the chair, across from the desk, her movements careful and deliberate. "Tom told me about them a few months before he died. He was going through his papers, getting things in order, and he couldn't decide what to do with that file. He was going to report me to the state board. He was considering all his options. Tom was nothing if not thorough." Margaret reached across the desk and touched the edge of the file. "But in the end, he chose to protect you instead." Henry looked at his brother's careful documentation of his failure, the precise calculations that proved beyond doubt what had happened that night. "This would have destroyed my career." Yes, it would have. David would have known the truth from the beginning. Yes, he would have. Henry met Margaret's eyes, seeing in them the same careful consideration Tom had always brought to difficult decisions. "Do you think Tom was wrong to protect me?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, weighing her words with the caution of someone who understood that some conversations could never be taken back. "I think Tom loved you both too much to make a clean choice," she said finally. "He couldn't bear to destroy your career, but he also couldn't bear to watch David worship a father who had made such a terrible mistake. So he chose a middle path that protected everyone and healed no one." The implications crashed over Henry like successive waves. Not only had he killed David's horse through his own negligence, but Tom had spent 26 years carrying the weight of that knowledge alone. Every family gathering, every conversation about David's career choice, every moment when Henry had complained about his son's distance, Tom had known the truth and had said nothing. Buck's condition deteriorated because no one was paying attention to the details. Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper, "Just like my relationship with David." Margaret nodded sadly. Sometimes the problems that seem too big to address just get bigger when you ignore them. Henry gathered the medical records into a neat stack, his hands steadier now that the initial shock had passed. "I need to show these to David. Henry, think about what you're doing. David has built his entire career partly on the foundation of believing his father was a good veterinarian who had one unlucky night. If you show him this, he'll know that I've been lying to him for 26 years. That Tom died protecting a secret that poisoned our family." Henry stood up from the desk, decision crystallizing with painful clarity. He'll know that every conversation we've had about professional standards and medical ethics has been built on a lie. Margaret rose too, her face creased with worry. "It could destroy whatever chance you have of rebuilding your relationship." or it could finally give us a foundation of honesty to build on. Henry walked to the barn to check on Buck, needing the comfort of the horse's steady presence while he processed this revelation. Buck was thriving now. His wound healed to the point where only a faint scar marked the site of his near-fatal infection. The old horse greeted Henry with a gentle nicker, accepting the carrots Henry offered with the same patient grace he'd shown throughout his recovery. "You got better because someone finally paid attention to what was really wrong," Henry told the horse, running his hands along the strong neck. "Maybe it's time for the rest of us to heal properly too." That evening, Henry called David from the farmhouse kitchen. The medical records spread on the table before him like playing cards in a high-stakes game. "Dad, is everything okay? It's late?" "No, it's not okay," Henry said, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "I need you to come to the farm. There's something else you need to know, something that changes everything I told you about Sunshine." A long pause. "Dad, I thought we'd talk through all of this. I found Tom's files today. Medical records, calculations, a letter he wrote but never sent." Henry closed his eyes, preparing to cross a line that would make retreat impossible. "David, the mistake I made was worse than I told you. Much worse. And Tom knew everything." Another pause, longer this time, filled with the weight of family secrets about to be exposed. "I'll be there tomorrow," David said quietly. After hanging up, Henry sat alone in the kitchen where 3 generations of his family had shared meals, celebrations, and the ordinary moments that connected one day to the next. Tomorrow, he would show his son the full extent of his failure as both a veterinarian and a father. He would reveal Tom's role in protecting him, and in doing so, would risk destroying the fragile progress they'd made over the past month. But Buck was healing properly now because Henry had addressed the real source of his infection rather than just treating the surface symptoms. Perhaps it was time to apply the same principle to his family. Henry spent the sleepless night before David's arrival writing a letter he wasn't sure he'd have the courage to deliver. He sat at the farmhouse kitchen table, surrounded by the detritus of false starts, crumpled pages filled with inadequate explanations, apologies that felt hollow, justifications that crumbled under the weight of 26 years of deception. The letter that finally emerged was simpler than he'd expected, stripped of everything except the essential truth. "David, I failed as your father long before I failed as Sunshine's veterinarian. The medication error that killed your horse was inexcusable, but the 26 years of lying about it were worse. Tom died protecting a secret that should have been yours to know from the beginning. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope someday you'll understand that my silence came from cowardice, not malice. You deserved a father who was brave enough to face his mistakes instead of one who hid behind your uncle's protection. Love, Dad." The letter sat on the kitchen table like an unexploded bomb while Henry went through the motions of his morning routine. Buck's care had become automatic, checking the healing wound, administering the final doses of antibiotics, observing the horse's return to normal movement and behavior. The Clydesdale was strong enough now to be turned out in the small paddock adjacent to the barn, where he rolled in the dirt with obvious pleasure and stood in the morning, sun like an animal who remembered what it felt like to be healthy. Margaret found Henry in the paddock, leaning against the fence and watching Buck explore his expanded world. "You don't have to do this," she said, settling beside him with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested the morning chill. "David seems to be accepting what you already told him. Maybe that's enough." Henry shook his head. "Buck got better because I treated the real problem, not just the symptoms. David and we've been treating symptoms for decades. But what if the cure is worse than the disease?" It was a fair question, one that had kept Henry awake through the long hours before dawn. David had built a successful life, partly on the foundation of believing his father was fundamentally decent despite his flaws. Learning that Henry had been dishonest about the most defining trauma of David's childhood could shatter that foundation entirely. Then at least we'll know what we're really dealing with, Henry said. David's car appeared in the driveway at 10:30, the silver sedan kicking up dust as it navigated the rutted gravel road. Henry watched his son emerge from the driver's seat, noting the careful way David surveyed the farmyard, cataloging changes and improvements with the analytical eye he'd inherited from both parents. "The place looks better," David said by way of greeting, his voice carefully neutral. "Buck seems to be doing well." They stood together at the paddock fence, watching the old horse graze with the contentment of an animal who no longer carried pain in every step. The healing had been dramatic and complete, a transformation that spoke to the power of proper attention and care. "He's ready to be a horse again," Henry said. "Amazing what can happen when someone addresses the real problem instead of just managing the pain." David glanced at his father sharply, catching the subtext in his words. "Dad, what exactly did you find in Tom's papers?" Henry pulled the medical records from his jacket pocket, the manila folder worn soft by his nervous handling over the past 18 hours. Everything. Tom documented everything. They walked to the farmhouse in silence, David's tension visible in the set of his shoulders and the measured pace of his steps. In the kitchen, Henry spread the documents across the table like evidence at a trial. His original notes from Sunshine's treatment, Tom's calculations proving the medication error, the unsent letter to the veterinary board. David read incomplete. Silence, his face growing pale as he processed the implications of what lay before him. Henry watched his son's expression change from confusion to understanding to something that might have been devastation, each revelation hitting like a physical blow. "A tenfold overdose," David said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You gave her 10 times the therapeutic dose." "Yes, and Tom knew. He calculated it, documented it, wrote a formal complaint." David looked up from the papers, his eyes filled with something Henry couldn't quite identify, but he never sent it. "He was protecting me, protecting my career, my reputation, my relationship with you." David set down the letter Tom had never sent, his hands trembling slightly. "All these years, I thought you were just unlucky that night. I thought Sunshine's death was one of those tragic things that happen despite everyone's best efforts. I let you think that because it was easier than admitting I'd made a mistake that killed something you loved. A mistake." David's voice carried a bitter edge. "You'd call it a mistake, but this documentation shows clear negligence. Fatigue-induced error that any competent veterinarian should have recognized and addressed by getting help or resting." The clinical assessment hit Henry harder than anger would have. David was speaking as a professional now, evaluating his father's conduct with the same objectivity he'd bring to reviewing a colleague's case file. "You're right," Henry said. "I was negligent. I was too proud to admit I was too exhausted to think clearly, too stubborn to ask for help, too focused on my reputation as the veterinarian who never turned down an emergency call." David stood up abruptly, pacing to the kitchen window that overlooked the barnyard where he'd spent so many childhood hours. "Do you have any idea what this means? I became a veterinarian partly because I wanted to understand what went wrong that night. I've spent my entire career trying to live up to professional standards that I thought you embodied. David, I've held you up as an example to my colleagues, my students, my own son. I've told people about the veterinarian who worked tirelessly to save animals, who cared so much about his patients that he'd work himself to exhaustion trying to help them." The pain in David's voice was worse than anger, carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of misplaced admiration. Henry had always known that David respected his professional reputation, but he'd never understood the extent to which his son had built his own identity around the myth of his father's competence. "I never asked you to hold me up as an example," Henry said quietly. "You didn't have to ask. You were my father." You were supposed to be the person I could look up to, the standard I measured myself against." David turned back to face Henry, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Instead, you've been living a lie for my entire adult life." Tom thought wrong. David's voice cracked with emotion. Tom thought he was protecting us, but he was actually poisoning our relationship with a secret that grew bigger every year. Henry felt the weight of his brother's misguided protection settling over him like a physical burden. Tom had made his choice out of love, but love without wisdom had created more damage than honesty would have caused. "You're right," Henry said. "Tom was wrong, and I was wrong to let him protect me. But David, I need you to understand something. The mistake I made with Sunshine was inexcusable, but it wasn't characteristic. In 45 years of practice, I never made another error of that magnitude. Because you learned from killing my horse." The blunt words hung in the air between them, brutal in their accuracy. Henry had indeed learned from Sunshine's death, had implemented protocols and safeguards that prevented him from ever again working while dangerously exhausted. "Yes, because I learned from killing your horse." David sank back into his chair, the fight going out of him as suddenly as it had appeared. "I don't know how to process this, Dad. I don't know how to reconcile the father I thought I had with the man who's been lying to me for 26 years. Henry reached across the table and placed the letter he'd written beside the medical records. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to try. But I hope someday you'll understand that my silence came from cowardice, not malice." David read the letter quickly, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he set it down and looked at his father with eyes that held the weight of decades of accumulated disappointment. "I need to think about this," David said finally. "I need time to figure out what this means for us, for my family, for everything I thought I knew about my childhood. I understand." David gathered the medical records into a neat stack, his movements careful and deliberate. "I'm going to take these with me. I need to study them to understand exactly what happened that night." Henry nodded, watching his son prepared to leave with the evidence of his greatest professional failure. "David, whatever you decide about about whether you can ever trust me again, I want you to know that becoming a veterinarian was the right choice. You're everything I pretended to be." David paused at the kitchen door, his hand on the knob. "That's the thing, Dad. I never wanted to be what you pretended to be. I wanted to be what I thought you actually were." After David left, Henry sat alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the echo of words that couldn't be taken back. The confession was complete now, the last of his secrets exposed to the harsh light of truth. Whatever came next, forgiveness or permanent estrangement, healing or final fracture, would be built on honest ground. Outside, Buck grazed peacefully in his paddock, his body strong and his spirit restored. The horse had survived his ordeal because someone had finally cared enough to address the real source of his suffering. Whether the same principle would apply to human relationships remained to be seen, but Henry had finally done what he should have done 26 years ago. He had told the truth. 5 days passed in silence that felt like years. Henry continued his routine caring for Buck, working in Tom's workshop, helping Margaret with farm maintenance, but the absence of communication from David hung over everything like a storm that wouldn't break. Margaret tried to fill the space with conversation about farm business and local news, but both of them were listening for the phone to ring, waiting for some sign that the truth hadn't destroyed everything beyond repair. On Thursday afternoon, as Henry was applying the final coat of varnish to the wooden horse he'd completed for Michael, his phone buzzed with a text message. David's name on the screen made Henry's hand shake as he opened it. "Can we talk? I'm outside." Henry looked through the workshop window to see David's car parked in the driveway, his son sitting behind the wheel with the engine running, as if he hadn't yet decided whether to stay or leave. Henry set down his brush and walked outside, noting that David looked older than he had 5 days ago. worn down by the weight of revelation and decision. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," Henry said, approaching the car with the careful movements of someone who understood that sudden gestures might spook a nervous animal. David turned off the engine and stepped out, pulling a manila folder from the passenger seat. Henry recognized it immediately, the medical records that documented his failure, now somehow transformed into evidence for a different kind of trial. "I had them reviewed," David said without preamble, "by Dr. Elizabeth Chun at the Veterinary College. She's an expert in medication errors and professional misconduct cases." Henry felt his stomach clench with anxiety. Having his mistake evaluated by a modern expert, judged by current standards of professional conduct, felt like being tried in a court where the verdict was predetermined. What did she say? David opened the folder and pulled out a typed report, several pages thick with official letterhead and careful analysis. She said the error was significant but not unprecedented. Fatigue-induced medication errors account for approximately 15% of serious veterinary malpractice cases. The clinical language felt both reassuring and devastating. Henry's failure had been cataloged, analyzed, and filed away as a statistic in someone's research database. She also said, David continued, his voice carefully controlled, that the medication error, while serious, was likely survivable if caught and treated immediately. The delay in recognizing the overdose was what made it fatal. Henry closed his eyes, remembering that terrible night with painful clarity. He'd administered the medication and left the barn, confident in his treatment plan, not returning to check on Sunshine until morning. By then, it had been too late to reverse the damage. "I should have stayed with her," Henry said quietly. "Should have monitored her response instead of assuming everything would be fine." "Yes, you should have." The simple agreement hurt more than anger would have. David wasn't trying to comfort him or minimize his responsibility. He was stating facts with the clinical objectivity that made him an excellent veterinarian. But Dr. Chun also said something else, David continued, pulling a small object from his jacket pocket. She said that veterinary medicine in 1997 didn't have the safety protocols we have today. Electronic medical records, automated dosage calculations, mandatory rest periods for practitioners working extended hours. The object in David's hand was a toy stethoscope, worn and faded, but still recognizable. Henry remembered buying it for David's 7th birthday, watching his son wear it around the house for weeks, pretending to examine every animal on the farm. "I still have it," David said, noticing Henry's recognition. "I keep it in my desk at the clinic as a reminder of why I became a veterinarian." "David, let me finish, Dad." David's voice was firm, but not unkind. "I kept that stethoscope because it reminded me of the father who taught me to care about animals, who showed me that healing was both a science and an art. After reading those medical records, after understanding what really happened that night, I realized something." David held up the toy stethoscope, its plastic surface reflecting the afternoon sun. "The father who gave me this, who taught me to listen carefully and observe closely, who instilled in me a respect for the responsibility we bear when we treat animals. That father was real. The mistake you made doesn't erase him." Henry felt tears threatening for the first time since childhood, the relief of partial forgiveness more overwhelming than he'd expected. "But the father who lied to me for 26 years, who let me build my entire professional identity around a false narrative, I'm still processing him." David lowered the stethoscope, his expression serious but not hostile. "I don't know if I can forgive the lying, Dad. The mistake, yes, mistakes are human. But the decades of deception, that's harder. I understand. Do you? Because I don't think you really comprehend what it means to discover that someone you've trusted your entire life has been fundamentally dishonest about something that shaped who you became." David's words carried the weight of genuine pain, the deep hurt that comes from discovering that foundational beliefs were built on shifting ground. Henry had expected anger, had prepared for rage and accusation. But this quiet disappointment was somehow worse, carrying the finality of a relationship that might never fully heal. What happens now? Henry asked. David looked toward the barn where Buck stood peacefully in his paddock, then back at his father. Now we figure out if it's possible to build something honest from what's left. They walked to the barn together, the first time in decades that Henry could remember moving in step with his son without the careful distance that had defined their relationship for so long. Buck greeted them at the paddock fence with the gentle curiosity of an animal who'd learned to trust human hands again, extending his massive head to accept the carrots David had brought from his car. "He looks remarkable," David said, running his hands along Buck's neck with the practiced assessment of a veterinarian. "When I saw him 3 weeks ago, I honestly wasn't sure he'd make it." "There were a couple of nights I wasn't sure either," Henry admitted. "The infection was more aggressive than I initially thought. Required round-the-clock care for the first week." David nodded, understanding the commitment that level of treatment required. "You did excellent work." Textbook management of a complex case. The professional praise felt different now, weighted with knowledge of Henry's past failure, but offered anyway. It was acknowledgement that competence and mistake could coexist, that a single error, even a catastrophic one, didn't negate a lifetime of skill and dedication. "I've been thinking," David said, continuing his examination of Buck's healing leg, "about something Dr. Chun said when we discussed the case. She told me that the best veterinarians she knows all have stories like this. Moments when fatigue or overconfidence or simple human error led to outcomes they'll never forget." Henry watched his son work, noting the gentleness in his touch, the careful way he assessed the horse's response to pressure and movement. David had inherited the best qualities of both his parents, Eleanor's compassion and Henry's technical skill, but had developed them within a framework of modern safety protocols that made errors like Sunshine's death far less likely. "The difference," David continued, "is that the good ones learn from their mistakes instead of hiding from them." "I did learn," Henry said quietly. "I instituted protocols in my practice after Sunshine died: mandatory rest periods, colleague consultations for complex cases, medication double checks. I never made another error of that magnitude." "But you didn't share those lessons with anyone else. You didn't publish a case study or speak at conferences about the importance of fatigue management. You just carried the knowledge privately." David's observation was painfully accurate. Henry had indeed learned from his mistake, but he'd kept those lessons to himself, missing opportunities to help other veterinarians avoid similar errors. His silence had protected his reputation, but had done nothing to advance the profession's understanding of human factors in medical errors. "I was too ashamed," Henry said, "too worried about what people would think. And that shame cost us 26 years of honest relationship." They stood together at the fence, watching Buck graze in the afternoon sun. The horse moved easily now, showing no sign of the injury that had nearly killed him just weeks before. His recovery was complete, his body strong, and his spirit restored by careful attention and proper treatment. "I brought you something," David said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small wrapped package, roughly the size of a book, and handed it to Henry with the careful formality of someone offering a peace treaty. Henry unwrapped the package to reveal a framed photograph, the image from Margaret's album, of David at 12, sitting bareback on Sunshine with pure joy radiating from his face. But this version had been professionally enlarged and enhanced. The colors brightened and the details sharpened until it glowed with life and happiness. "I had it printed from the negative Mom saved," David said. "I wanted you to see what I looked like before everything got complicated between us." Henry stared at the photograph, remembering the boy who trusted him completely, who believed his father could fix anything with skill and determination. That trust had been broken by more than Sunshine's death. It had been eroded by years of distance and deception that followed. "David, I'm not ready to forgive you completely," David interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "The lying, the wasted years, the way you let Uncle Tom carry that burden alone, those things are going to take time for me to process." Henry nodded, understanding that forgiveness couldn't be rushed, that healing required patience and careful attention, just like Buck's recovery. "But," David continued, "I don't want to waste any more time being angry about things that can't be changed. You made a terrible mistake, and then you made it worse by lying about it. But you're still my father, and you're still the person who taught me to care about healing." David pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found what he was looking for. "Sarah's been after me to bring the kids to see the farm. Michael's old enough now to appreciate it, and Emma would love the animals." The offer hung between them, not forgiveness, exactly, but possibility. A chance to build something new on the foundation of truth rather than the shifting ground of protective lies. "I'd like that very much," Henry said, his voice rough with emotion. "Good, because I think it's time for them to know their grandfather. The real one, with all his flaws and all his strengths." As they prepared to leave the barn, Henry's phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "How did it go?" Henry showed the message to David, who smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth Henry had seen from him in weeks. "Tell her we're working." "On it," David said. "Tell her it's going to take time, but we're working on it." 3 months later, the sign hanging over the farm's entrance read, "Callahan and Son Veterinary Retreat," in letters carved from oak and painted in traditional farm colors. Henry had crafted the sign himself in Tom's workshop, taking particular pride in the wood selection and joinery that would allow it to weather decades of seasons without losing its strength or beauty. The transformation of the farm had been gradual but profound. What had once been a struggling family operation, clinging to memories of better times, had evolved into something entirely new, a place where retired veterinarians could bring their expertise to help animals who needed specialized care, where young practitioners could learn from experienced colleagues, and where families could heal alongside the creatures they loved. The idea had emerged naturally from conversations between Henry and David as they'd worked to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than protective lies. David's clinic in Portland had begun referring complex cases that required extended rehabilitation, and Henry had found purpose in providing the kind of intensive patient care that modern veterinary practices couldn't always accommodate. Buck had become the retreat's unofficial mascot and its first success story. The old Clydesdale greeted visitors at the paddock fence, his gentle demeanor and obvious health serving as living proof that healing was possible even when situations seemed hopeless. Children who came to visit animals being treated at the retreat invariably gravitated toward Buck, drawn by his size and gentleness in equal measure. This morning, Henry watched from the kitchen window as his grandson Michael led Buck around the Vada. Small training ring, both boy and horse, moving with the confidence that came from genuine partnership. At 10 years old, Michael had inherited the family's instinctive understanding of animals. But more importantly, he'd been allowed to develop that gift within a framework of honesty and open communication. "He's got good hands," Margaret observed, settling beside Henry with coffee for both of them. "Reminds me of you at that age, before you got all wrapped up in trying to be perfect." Margaret had become the retreat's business manager, bringing to the operation the organizational skills and practical wisdom that had kept the farm running during Tom's illness and after his death. She'd also become something Henry hadn't expected, a partner in the daily work of creating something meaningful from the remnants of past mistakes. "David's here," Margaret said, nodding toward the driveway where David's car was pulling up beside the renovated barn. that now served as the retreat's main treatment facility. Henry's relationship with his son remained a work in progress, marked by careful honesty and gradual rebuilding of trust. They spoke regularly now, consulting on difficult cases and sharing insights drawn from their combined decades of experience. The easy camaraderie they'd once shared might never be fully restored, but they'd found something perhaps more valuable. A partnership built on mutual respect and acknowledged imperfection. David emerged from his car carrying a small travel carrier, the telltale sounds from within, suggesting another patient for the retreat's growing census of animals requiring specialized care. "What have you brought us today?" Henry asked, joining his son beside the treatment barn. "Kitten with a complex fracture. Owner can't afford the surgery, but she's a good candidate for rehabilitation if we can get the bone to heal properly." David's expression carried the professional satisfaction of someone who'd found a way to help when conventional options had been exhausted. They worked together to examine the kitten, their conversation flowing easily between technical assessment and treatment planning. Henry had forgotten how much he enjoyed collaborating with another veterinarian. The way shared expertise could illuminate solutions that neither practitioner might find alone. "Anna wants to help with the afternoon treatments," David said as they settled the kitten into a recovery cage, equipped with all the monitoring equipment Henry had installed over the past months. "Sarah thinks she's too young, but I remember someone letting his 8-year-old son help with wound care." The reference to David's childhood carried no sting now, just acknowledgement of experiences that had shaped both their careers. Emma, David's 6-year-old daughter, had already declared her intention to become a veterinarian like her father and grandfather, though her current focus seemed to be primarily on cuddling rather than clinical skills. Wound care might be advanced, Henry said, but she could help with feeding and grooming. Animals need affection as much as medical treatment. As afternoon faded toward evening, 3 generations of Callahans gathered around the kitchen table. For dinner, a scene that would have seemed impossible just months before. Emma regaled them with detailed accounts of every animal she'd encountered during her day at the retreat, while Michael demonstrated the proper technique for leading a large horse using a piece of rope and his patient sister as a stand-in for. Buck. Sarah documented the evening with photographs, understanding intuitively that these moments of ordinary family joy needed to be preserved. Henry found himself grateful for her presence. She served as a bridge between past and future, someone who knew David and the children without the weight of old disappointments and half-healed wounds. "Grandpa Henry," Emma said, tugging on his sleeve with the persistence of someone accustomed to adult attention. "Will you tell us about Buck again? About how he got hurt and how you made him better?" Henry glanced at David, who nodded encouragingly. The story of Buck's recovery had become family legend, told and retold with the embellishments that transformed ordinary events into tales worth preserving. But unlike the stories Henry had told David as a child, this one was grounded in truth acknowledgement of mistakes alongside celebration of success. "Well," Henry began, settling Emma on his lap while Michael leaned against his chair, "sometimes the hardest part of healing isn't the medicine or the surgery. Sometimes it's having the courage to look at what's really wrong instead of just treating what you can see on the surface." Outside, Buck grazed peacefully in his paddock, his body strong and his spirit restored. The old workhorse had taught them all that healing was possible, even when wounds seemed too deep to mend. Sometimes it just required patience, careful attention, and the willingness to address the real source of pain rather than merely managing its symptoms. The farmhouse filled with the sounds of family dinner, laughter, and storytelling, gentle teasing and shared memories. It was everything Henry had missed during the years when work had consumed his attention and guilt had poisoned his relationships. Now, surrounded by children who knew him as he truly was rather than as he'd pretended to be, Henry understood that this was what healing actually looked like. Not the absence of scars, but the presence of love strong enough to encompass them.